The cranked snare side head. It's always out there. We're going to take a different direction today, talk about what there is to be gained by this possibly, and what you definitely lose in the process. We've really been going down the rabbit hole here at Sounds Like a Drum about the idea between prescriptions and methodologies. There are a lot of prescriptions for getting you the best sound or the right sound or a usable sound on the internet, lots of people talking about them. We prefer methodologies because it leads you to a sound instead. Coming out of the gate with saying the right way to tune a snare side head is to crank it very tight is definitely a prescription, not a methodology. But rather than getting frustrated with what this is, we're going to do a little more of a pros and cons approach today and look at what there is to be gained by this, why someone would choose to do this, and then what we lose in the process that maybe we didn't even realize we were losing. Let's have a listen to the snare drum in front of me right now, and then we're going to talk about what's going on here. Today, I tuned this drum to sound like this on purpose, and I want to say right up front, I'm not saying this is a bad sound. This is the sound of a very tight snare side head with my normal batter head tension that I tend to aim for when I want a middle of the road sound with good warmth, fatness, articulation, clarity, all that stuff. We happened to trot out the drum dial today to get extra scientific, and for anyone that was curious about what this actually is, we are looking at 85 on the dial on the batter and also 85 on the snare side, which I will tell you is significantly tighter than I normally go. Let's start with the perceived positives of making this choice. Depending on who you talk to, you will hear some or all of the following things. More articulation, a more cracking, aggressive snare rimshot sound. Sometimes people talk about wanting drier snare response, particularly for rolls and things like that, so that the articulation doesn't get lost. And another one that I hear personally from students often is that this gets them more clarity in terms of no matter where they are on the dynamic range, the listener hearing exactly what they're doing out there and not just where we're sitting. This is interesting because in terms of the physics of tightening up the wires and maybe having tighter heads as well, it seems like it should get us these things. But as I'm already hearing in these demos, because of the tension on the snare side head, some of these perceived positives are absolutely not happening. For anyone watching that feels like maybe our wires aren't tight enough, the wires are very tight. In fact, if I play the drum really softly, you can hear the batter head actually choking out. For anybody watching that feels like we don't have the batter head tuned high enough, well, the prescriptions out there for this don't tell me that I have to tune the batter in any particular way. So if I'm supposed to be going super tight on the snare side as a starting point, then that means that this isn't a usable tuning range for this drum, which is factually incorrect. We tune it in this range all the time, albeit with a snare side head maybe more like 75 than 85. And thirdly, and this is my favorite, that I'm not hitting it hard enough. Like if I hit it harder, the actual strike is going to be louder enough than all of these overtones flying around that they're not going to matter. That's crazy. Like we're gonna call this a starting point and then say that I have to hit it a certain way? That doesn't make any sense. This is the fundamental problem with tuning prescriptions. All sorts of prescriptions, not just tuning, but we're here to talk about tuning today. If you just take turn-by-turn instructions and assume that by taking them you're going to end up at the same place as everybody else, that may be true in a car, but it's not true with an instrument. It just isn't. There are too many variables going on here, starting with the sort of wires we're using, the thicknesses of the heads that we're using, the room that we're in, the hoops on the drum, the way the drum is made, how deep the drum is. All of these things necessitate being more thoughtful in the process of trying to generate a sound rather than going for what is usable, which I don't think we should ever be going for usable. It sounds terrible. Now, if all of those aspects that I just mentioned seem like a really daunting and complicated process, the cool thing is you actually don't really have to think about those individually because we're just listening to the drum as we go. So it doesn't matter what kind of hoops you have or what size your drum is or what your wires are. Use your ear, follow your ear through the process, and you'll get to a sound that's going to make you happy, as opposed to, and this has happened, I know people that do this, tune the drum to a prescription, hit it, they don't like it, and they sell the drum because they think they don't like the drum. One more thing that really needs to be said here also, for anyone watching that heard that and went, oh, you just need to put 2 or 3 moon gels on there. I don't know what to say to that. If you have a prescription for tuning that necessitates putting external mass on the drum to make it usable, not just great, but like to make it not problematic, I don't understand how you can call that a functional way to tune a drum. It seems crazy. Now, the other side of this, the losses, we've already kind of dove into them in the previous portion of this video, but just to get really specific, I want to touch on a couple that we didn't get to. Something that is not exactly clear unless you listen to the drum with the wires off is how much fundamental and tone we're losing by tuning this way. We are functionally choking the snare side head, which means that the fundamental pitch of the batter, which is to say the root of this tuning, is completely gone, and what we're left with is the first harmonic and things above that, which is why it sounds like there are so many overtones. The tension of the resonant head is not allowing the batter to resonate because it's too tight. So this drum sounds thinner, it sounds punchy in a way, but then all of that tension on the snare side head is allowing the harmonics above the fundamental to ring for days, which is how you end up with this idea that we'll just put a bunch of gels on there and then it'll be fine, and then you wonder why your rim shot sounds like a box. Number 2, we did talk about this, but this does limit us to the tuning range that works with the tension of the resonant head, and that means high. And I don't know about you, but I don't always want to tune my drum super high. Sometimes I want to tune it low and have it big and fat. And I guarantee you, if you want that sound, A, you may need some muffling, and B, you gotta let the tension off the snare side head because it is shortening the sound of the drum. If you want a big fat sound, you need a big fat sound. There's nothing else to say about that. Something that's difficult to communicate through video, we've talked about it a little bit, and the drum dial might be helpful for your experiments at home. The drum feels stiff. It doesn't feel good to hit in the center. It feels okay with a rim shot, but if you want to do anything other than a rim shot, it feels a little tabletop-y in the middle and choked, even though the batter is not that tight. This is not going to improve by tuning the batter higher because then you're going to be experiencing the tension of the batter head in that range, which is going to get us a different sound. If we wanted a mid sound like we're going for here, it's just not going to happen. Now, the elephant in the room. Snare side heads are extremely thin. If you sit down at your drum and tune the Reso super duper tight, the first time you do this, you are ending the possibility of using that head at a low tension. You might be able to use it at a mid tension, but if you want to experiment with the lower tuning of that head, it's done because we've stretched it out. These heads stretch out over time anyway because there are sound waves hitting them. They're moving all the time, every time we hit the drum, even though we're not hitting that head. Now, having said that, if you've ever had a very tight snare head on your drum for a while and pulled it off, you can see that it looks like a bowl. That means that that head is not able to even kind of help with the fundamental of the drum at all. It's totally dead. If you want to be able to experiment with different tensions on the snare side head, please get a new one for starters and experiment in the low range first. It's worth mentioning that even at the highest tunings that we do when we're demoing sounds here, setting aside extreme experiments where we're doing it on purpose, we never ever tune the snare side heads this high. This whole thing of being able to measure it with a dial is fairly new to us here. Normally we just use our ears and maybe try to listen to the note that it is, but I can tell you this is orders of magnitude higher than I ever use, even for super high like ska or police kind of sounds or drum and bass stuff. If I wanted a sound that was that high, I would use a smaller drum because then you can get up into that stratosphere without having to add that much tension. There's a lot of videos of people doing those kinds of tunings with piccolos, power piccolos, popcorn snares, timbali snares. The world is your oyster. You don't have to crank up your 14 and ruin the heads. So just to recap, in terms of positives, we are looking at possibly gaining articulation, possibly gaining some clarity for the audience, getting a more cracking rim shot, hopefully, getting less crosstalk from toms. It's not really the center of this video, but that's something that we have heard from people in the forums and elsewhere. And finally, drying out the snare response, having less sustain in the snares and a tighter sound overall. In contrast, things that we are losing are tone and resonance from the drum because we're choking out the fundamental. We are getting a lot more overtones without that fundamental, which bleed into all the mics and force us to use some kind of muffling to make the sound manageable and usable. By tuning the Reso this way, we are no longer able to have a wide range of options with the batter because, as you can see, this mid-range is wild and crazy, though if we cranked it up, it would be more usable. The feel becomes very stiff, starts to feel a little more like a tabletop, and doesn't have that nice cushy feeling that we want out of both a rim shot and striking it in the center. And finally, we are right out of the gate limiting the life of this snare side head, particularly if we want to experiment with lower tunings on the snare side head in conjunction with trying different things out on the batter. The bottom line here is that we don't want to start with extremes. We want to move in increments always and make sure that we keep track of what happened in those statements that we're making with our drum so that we can go back for them later if we found something that we love, and also create a Rolodex of possibilities anytime that we're not sure what we want to do. If the idea, again, of experimenting with lower tunings in the snare side seems daunting, please go back to some of our earlier videos where we have our own methodologies, not prescriptions, for getting an even sounding snare side head that you can then move through different ranges to see what happens. Maybe you'll like it, maybe you'll hate it. The only one way to find out.